ปั๊มปากซอยน้องนาขายส้มตำหนุ่มแท็กซี่รูปหล่อและหนุ่มสามล้อมาอุดหนุนประจำแต่คืนนี้ยังไม่เห็นพี่มาแต่คืนนี้ยังไม่เห็นพี่มาหรือว่าพี่ยาเปลี่ยนที่กินส้มตำส้มตำน้องคงไม่อร่อยไม่เหมือนแถวซอยสุทธิสารตรอกสามหนุ่มแท็กซี่เลยเพื่ออาจไปติดสาวเนื้อที่ขายเพียงคำหนุ่มสามล้อก็ไม่เห็นมีแววหนุ่มสามล้อก็ไม่เห็นมีแววเคยมาจีบเจ้าเจ้าแต่คืนนี้เงียบงำแม่ค้าส้มตำอีสาน
Good afternoon from Honolulu, Hawaii, and thank you for joining us for the last loose webinar for our academic year. Today, the loose series is focused on loose Southeast Asia and transition, and the webinar examines the transformations through 4 critical lenses, and we have done this over the course of the year: disasters and resilience, borders and belonging, artistic resistance, and smart urban futures. Each theme highlights how Southeast Asian communities navigate uncertainty, new forms of solidarity, and imagine alternative futures beyond inherited state-driven models. Together, the series offers an interdisciplinary look at how Southeast Asia is reshaping itself amid global and regional change. So I'd like to welcome everybody from Southeast Asia who's joining us, everyone on the continent, good evening. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ariel Mota Alves, who's our doctoral student in political science, soon to graduate, I hope. Ariel, on to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teri. As Teri said, my name is Ariel. I'm about to graduate from UH Manoa. I'm really excited to moderate our panel for today, called Imagining Borders, Nationality, Mobility, and Belonging in Southeast Asia. This webinar will touch on the topics of stateless populations, informal crossing, and temporary migration. And our speakers hopefully will help us to rethink about nationality and belonging through the lived realities of border communities. So I'd like to first introduce our speakers for today, as well as their topics. Our first speaker is Gading Gumilang Putra, who will be talking about stateless population, informal crossings, and temporary migration in Indonesia. Gading serves as a national focal point for advocacy at Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia, or GRS. Since 2009, GRS Indonesia has played a key role in accompanying refugees and asylum seekers, initially working with Rohingya communities in Aceh and North Sumatra, and subsequently expanding its engagement to immigration detention centers and urban refugee contexts across West Java and Jakarta. He has also contributed to the strategic direction of emergency response and protection interventions in Aceh, particularly with regards to Rohingya response since 2021. His presentation will examine stateless population through the lens of the concept called transit country paradox, where movement intended to be temporary often becomes prolonged, leaving refugees and asylum seekers trapped in conditions of uncertainties. His presentation will interrogate the structural limitations of current responses by humanitarian actors and local stakeholders in Indonesia across the region. Our next speaker is Lian Bawi Thang. He will talk about political transformation in Myanmar highlands, a shift from identity from mobility to a fixed forms. Lian is a PhD candidate of political science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, at a former ISWA Center graduate degree fellow. He is an ethnic Chiang, previously worked as a political analyst and activist in Myanmar for 10 years. He was also a board member and a founding member of the Myanmar Indigenous People Network. His presentation will touch on identity transformation in the highlands from mobility and fluidity to textualized and fixed forms. He will also look at how contemporary resistance fighters and activists employ this fluid identity in terms of border crossings. Our last speaker is Dr. Prista Ratanapruck. Her title of the talk today is called Mobility and Belonging, Banangi Trade Diaspora in South and Southeast Asia. Dr. Prista receives her BA in Economics and PhD in Anthropology from Harvard University. She is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Integrated Development Studies in Nepal. She previously taught history at Rutgers University, as well as anthropology at the University of Virginia, Chiang Mai University in Thailand, and Nepal School of Science and Humanities. Her current book, Market and Monastery, is an exceptional contribution to the study of connected histories. The book explores network of the Nepali Manangi trading community, which linked the Himalayas to Southeast Asia. Her talk today will examine the role of cross-cultural marriages and Tibetan Buddhist monasteries from the Manang Valley in northern Nepal that has traded across the Himalayas and Southeast Asia since the 17th century, and how these interactions sustain transgressional society that is embedded in multiple nation states. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Gading, to start us off, followed by Lian, and then end with Dr. Prista. I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, Ariel. Allow me to share my screen. Can you hear me okay? Just want to double check.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I apologize. I might have to turn off my camera because of the internet connections I have here. Thank you very much for having me and also GRS Indonesia. Good morning or evening, depending on your time zone. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Gading and I'm with the Jesuit Refugee Service Indonesia. Today I will share reflections from mainly our field experience working with refugees and asylum seekers, which also at risk to become a stateless, particularly on how mobility and temporariness are experienced in Indonesia. Congratulations also, because I heard that this is the last webinar series conducted by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. To begin with, once I received the title from the committee, from the organizing committee, once I read about the temporary, it's always a rarely temporarily when it comes to Indonesia. For many refugees and stateless individual, transit is not a phase, but a condition they are forced to live in. What is intended as transit often becomes years of waiting for mobility and belonging, which is the big topics of the webinars. What happens to mobility and belonging when movement is suspended for such a long time? So that's the disclaimer and also the main questions or reflections from the Indonesia context that temporary is rarely a temporary. And you might hearing me often in mentioning that. To start with the context in Indonesia, per January 2026, Indonesia hosts around 12,164 individuals of asylum seekers and refugees. Consists of majority country of origin from Afghanistan, Myanmar, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and so on. The number is stable over the past decade and relatively smaller, I'm sorry for the typo, compared to both of populations of the country, which is 200 million plus, and its neighboring countries or the refugee populations at the neighboring country that hosts asylum seekers and refugees. It may be small in number, but protracted in durations. The issue is not scale, but the temporariness become prolonged. I'll come to the paradox of the transit. Well, Indonesia is often described as a transit country. However, it functions as one without having the institutional and legal architecture to support it. I mainly work on the advocacy, so looking from the landscape of institutional and legal architecture, while the word transit often been mentioned, is quite a phenomenon in Indonesia. It creates gap between expectation of the movement, which we assume that the movement is really moving, while the reality of the governance is not. Non-signatory status of 1951 conventions and also 1967 protocol, both are considered as the international covenant for the refugees protections, is often abused in my context or in our context as justifications for the legitimation of this transit status or transit country. Meanwhile, Indonesia is located within the key regional migration routes. While the movement intended as temporary and it becomes prolonged, waiting as condition, it's no longer a phase. It can take people 8 until 12 years or more. Meanwhile, there is a limited pathways to durable solutions, the one that we often hear about returning to the country where it's safe, the country of origins, well, it's safe, which is not really the case. Local integrations with the proper documentation is also not the case. And we also know that the global number of resettlement is very, very low. So it's not transitional, it's institutionalized. Meanwhile, the statelessness, which usually come as a different category than asylum seekers and refugees, but often in Indonesia, in practice, it looks at the same treatment. It's not only the legality of the documents itself, but how it's being lived. The Rohingyas account for about 70% of 2.6 million population of statelessness in Asia Pacific, which is, according to UNHCR, our region, not Southeast Asia, but Asia Pacific, hosts the majority of the world's stateless populations. 2,600 resides in Indonesia. These are the numbers of the Rohingyas. Meanwhile, the refugee and asylum seekers, many at risk of statelessness, are also present in Indonesia, so beyond Rohingya. But they, in a way, live in similar situations beyond its administrative status. In terms of journey and crossings, as you want us to speak upon, in Indonesia, there are the maritime routes that we can often see on the media. We see on the Andaman Sea crisis, Rohingya arrivals within 2020 until 2024. I had a chance to actually, or GRS had a chance to actually being present in Aceh for this arrivals and also this big numbers of arrivals, especially due to the situations in Bangladesh and also in Myanmar as well. So those are the main maritime routes that we see, mainly go from Cox's Bazar, then all the way to Indonesia after being rejected several times, and it can take weeks. Informal entry points can be informal port or the airports, and usually through the help or through the only service provided by the smuggler. And these irregular and often dangerous journeys happens because there is always limited legal and safe pathways. During the weeks at sea with limited food and water, we hear a lot of cases when we actually. So one of the response that JRS did is called the crash modifier. It's a 72-hour response, especially after the emergency situations, and one that we consider is the boat disembarkations. So during those times, often we hear the stories about exploitations, people drink urine and seawater, throw bodies at sea, and so on. And the only thing they can do, why it's only through smuggler, because that's the only pathway they can access. And there is also a risk of trafficking as well throughout their journey. These are some of the photo. I don't share much, but these are the typical boat that we see in Aceh, especially carrying 100 to 100 Rohingya. I think recently, about a few weeks ago, we hear also about 250 plus, suspected around 250 plus people died. The boat capsized, and only 8 survivors after they are being rejected. Um, Once they cross, what happens? That's what I call a life in transit. People will face legal uncertainty once they arrive in Indonesia. No formal rights to work, and access to service is limited. Um, years without Years of waiting without relocation certainty. And the context in Indonesia, there is a semi-camp context where there is a limited freedom of movement. There are also the urban setting, which I think the negotiations of belonging is happening quite a lot there as a good practice or agencies of the refugees themselves. And sometimes they also live in the dedicated shelter. So the arrangement of living can be different between one place to another. Thankfully, since 2018, detention is no longer a norm, although the risk of being detained is still there, both in policy and in practice. In terms of no right to works, it brings impacts also on the access to place to stay, food, medical care, and also mental health concerns. Several research already confirmed this, and this is a longitudinal survey on the mental health situations. It leads to obviously a limited access to service because of the situations that we see at the moment, because they are excluded in the legal system and social service by the policy. There was also a funding cut as well, and that also bring limited access to educations, both from the national system and the one that is provided by the community or by the NGO. The dependence on humanitarian assistance becoming inevitable because Indonesia heavily rely on the international organizations. And it doesn't stop there, because once you actually start making requests for financial assistance or cash-based assistance, for instance, then you get often rejected due to limited quota. And also people face limited response on communications. So this is the time where the refugees enter a prolonged period of waiting. Okay, I'll continue the next one. And this is a type of one of the refugees, one of the examples of the refugees when they cannot access assistance from the NGOs or from the international organizations, and they also do not have shelters. Then they set up tents and often live right in front of UNHCR office or even somewhere else on the street. This is just a text we received this morning. I'm not a refugee myself, and we start actually advocating for refugees to speak for themselves. But this is the least I can do is copy paste the message that we received this morning from our field office. 12 years in Indonesia, 2 years on the street in front of UNHCR office. I'm breaking down. Please, I need resettlement. I have to support my family. They only depends on me. Please, from last night until I didn't eat anything or water. So what about the negotiations, quote unquote, that the situations falls upon? Despite these constraints, people, whether they like it or not, actively negotiate their lives. They engage in informal economies, rely on community support, and continuously negotiate their sense of belonging with local communities. Although not so much on informal economies, because the risk of detention, as I earlier mentioned, and also because of the availability of informal job is very, very limited. Obviously, access to work or even income generating activity is clearly being prohibited in Indonesia. In terms of community support system, one of the negotiations is by the growing refugee-led organization and initiative. More and more a way to include the local to the activity of the refugees, vice versa has been, although the number is very small, we can see that it's growing along with the growing refugee-led organization and initiative. It also happens with the minimizing language barrier, and this is where the prolonged or the temporary that is not so temporary become important because initially learning the local language or Bahasa Indonesia might not be a top priority because the refugee might think that it's temporary, it's transit. The government definitely wants to think that this is transit. The NGO often, if it can be an autocritic, the agencies, the NGOs, humanitarian organizations design a program that is temporarily. So a structural change is very limited. Hence, the language being studied originally was not Indonesia but also English. And also negotiating belonging with the local communities through increasing narrative of refugee meaningful participations. Often the refugees do not have a place to sit on the table, but it's becoming clear, in my opinion, that it is their table. They should be there. And also works on advocacy push towards inclusion and policy change by start looking at the academia, government's champions who actually would like to think further on how to keep things balanced, especially in Indonesia, the narrative between security and also human rights or protections for the refugees. So in terms of the law versus reality, it highlights the fundamental gap between formal frameworks, as I mentioned earlier, with the lived experience or the lived realities. Many individuals exist in a space of legal invisibility where they are present but not fully recognized. That's why I said it's present without recognition. This contributes to protracted displacement in the sense the irregular mobility is not an exception, but a structural condition shaped by limited pathways and the regional gaps. Before I talk about regional gaps, I think it's fair to mention about the responses. I don't put it in detail, also not the features of the actors, because I also do not want to share or to show it as a GRS centric because there are a lot of actors, especially from the community themselves, who actually try to respond to these situations. So there's also humanitarian actors, faith-based organizations, a little bit minimum on the human rights organizations, but it's becoming more and more a bridge between humanitarian and human rights in order to respond it because I think more people start to be aware that this is beyond humanitarian, but also right-based perspective should be explored to be used as well for protection, especially that people live for a long time. Local stakeholders also, in a way, they provide a safe space by not conducting any rejection, for instance, especially in urban setting. Although exceptions had happened on the Rohingya arrival in 2023, 2024, if you see there are a massive use of TikTok, Instagram, and social media that has been used for spreading misinformation, hate speech that actually leads to rejections on the ground and bring a protection concern where people were excluded from the response. And the last one is the community-led coping strategies. So while the humanitarian organizations has a limited role, the international organizations also have the limited role, and the government have also limited or take no role. Then the community-led coping strategies is always been the first and foremost strong system in Indonesia. Although we see it's also creating more and more barriers day by day, especially with the situation of the world that we see today. And if we take a look at the Southeast Asia, I don't know if it's appropriate to say it here, but it seems that human rights is often considered to be a sensitive topic to touch, especially with the current conditions of the governance at the moment. I mean, let alone about the government, let alone about the human rights, talking about our democracy, talking about how participations of the people, it's becoming more and more difficult. Sorry. So the structural limitation and the regional dimension that I would like to share here, as I promised earlier, is the fragmented responsibility sharing. It turns into the last point. Instead of responsibility sharing, it turns into a responsibility shifting. It's easier to look at who is who should be taking that responsibility, and usually the one who actually mentioned that often the government, and I'm not talking only about Indonesia, but also other governments. Absence of the regional protection mechanisms, and this is where I think this is where it's relevant with the Southeast Asia. Policy constraint at the national level as well. It's become very difficult as well to be responded. As a result, the burden is often informally shifted to transit countries. So when we're talking about the narrative of the refugees, often the narrative is the narrative of the global north, and mainly the refugees live in the global south, including Indonesia, although the number is not many, as I mentioned earlier. Uh, and once it's shifted to the transit countries without adequate support, or worse, to international organizations or humanitarian organizations. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, mobility exists without corresponding protection framework, and it creates a situations where movement is possible, but protection is limited. And it reinforced the needs of more meaningful regional cooperations, if I may add that a little bit. Um, Kak Ari, let me know if I'm start running out of time. I still have a couple slides, I think, after this. I cannot see the screens. Okay, so this is, I think, the
Maybe like
last.
take 2 minutes and then.
Okay, two minutes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'll try to be quickly share this because it might not touch directly on the presentation, but I felt that there's a growing trend of migration that happens everywhere, not only in Europe or in the US, but also in the Southeast Asia. It's a trend of exclusion by creating various categories under immigration law or frameworks, calling refugees with a different name, different status for different nationalities, for instance. It's not only taking away people from their rights, but also promotes the culture of prejudice, stigma, hatred, and hostility. The next trend that I also see, and a lot of people are already talking about it, is also externalizations, the practice of outsourcing border control and migration management to the third countries, often outside a state's own territory. So I'm not gonna mention the example there, but it's right on the screen. On the expulsion, there is a forcible remover, including deporting, repatriating, and relocating. So this 3E is quite concerning, and it seems that it's the trend that we see nowadays. Instead of spending more mechanisms, systems, and collaboration for protection, it turns into a hostile response towards our fellow human being. So when temporary becomes long-term waiting, mobility becoming immobility and inclusion become exclusion, it raises critical questions of what would be whether the belonging that we earlier discussed can be negotiated in this type of situations, especially when inclusions become conditional. Okay, on the reflections points, I'm gonna go to the last slides. When we speak about borders, we often imagine clear lines on a map. But for refugees and stateless individuals in Indonesia, those borders are lived as uncertainty, waiting, and constant negotiations. What does it mean for migrations to be temporary when it lasts for years? In Indonesia, this question is not theoretical. It defines the lived reality of refugee and stateless population navigating prolonged uncertainty in legal, but also a social limbo. If temporary becomes permanent, then our frameworks must evolve accordingly. Otherwise, we risk normalizing a system where uncertainty itself becomes a long-term condition of life. Ultimately, the question is not only how people move, but how they are allowed to live while waiting, and whether our systems are willing to recognize the dignity beyond legal status. And these realities, I suppose, invite all of us here to rethink not only about mobility, but also the meaning of belonging, just like the title of this webinar, in the context of prolonged displacement, and to collectively share responsibility when temporary becomes indefinite. Thank you very much, Kak Ariel, and apologize for the overtime. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kak. Next, we'll just go right to Lian, EP. Okay, take your time.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, for inviting me. Actually, the Myanmar is, I will go very quick. So, just to give a little background, I think that the country of Myanmar is kind of really relevant for this webinar to cover with. The country offers one of the Southeast Asia most complex kind of example of borders, nationality, and contestant belonging. So, ethnically, it is the second most diverse in the regions after Indonesia's, and there are 135 ethnic groups. That classification is, of course, very problematic. And there are ongoing mass migration, refugee, and statelessness problems, which are driven by state exclusive policies over half a century of armed conflicts, especially which is worsened after 2021 military coup, and which also have like impact on the country economy downfalls. So as of 2025 June, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee estimate that there are 4.4 million statelessness people in the world, and within that numbers, like 1.5 million are Rohingyas. Most of them are living in either the Bangladesh and Myanmar sides. And what happened was after 2021, the refugee numbers and migration is also rapidly increased from Myanmar to other countries, especially UNHCR estimate that as of since 2021, there are 300,000 Burmese people has fled to the neighboring countries. I think 50% are in Bangladesh, 21 in India, like 20% in Thailand, 8% in Malaysia, and the small kind of number in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. And all of these problems like armed conflict, statelessness issue, IDP, refugee issue are somehow kind of like related to our today topic, nationalities, mobility, and belonging. So We'll try to have discuss and frame the current Myanmar politics through the lens of our topic today, especially the, I will try to frame that. Is this because of, is this part of the identity transformation from mobility to kind of like fixed kind of like systems? And in this presentation, I'm kind of more focused on Myanmar highland society, particularly the Chiang, Kachin, and Karen. And of course, I will include a little bit of Rohingya, although it's not my expertise, but I think this is, the topic, one of the topic itself is statelessness. So I think it would not be fair, it's like not to include it, even if it's just not like my expertise. And going back to the term, the highland society in Myanmar, the term highland itself is a little vague. Locally, we are using Pota that has two meanings. Basically, one is those who literally reside in the mountains, and second is those who inhabited far away from the central region. So I rely on that vague concepts, like when I mention about the highland. And in fact, the Karen, some of them are, reside in the lowland, or what we call the delta zones. So before colonizations, identity in Myanmar, like identity in Burma, are so much local centric and flexible and fluid, right? And people are identified through clan, lineage, village, or tribes, rather than kind of like broad categories like, Chiang, Kachin, or Karen, which I think like comes later with the most usage. These terms were used to refer to some of these, some of particular groups, but the usage of Chiang, Kachin, Karen becomes more and more kind of like widespread, especially after the colonizations. And what we see was, especially in the book of Political System of Highland Burma, case study of Kachin, I think one of the examples that Edmund Leach demonstrate was community are moving between the egalitarian and hierarchical system between Kamsa and Kamlaos. So we see that, identity are so much, fluid. And territory was not imagined as rigid national home space as today. Community are connected to customary land, root, but pre-colonial belonging was so much based on network, mobility, and sphere of influence rather than a fixed border. And what happened was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we have seen a shift from fluidity to kind of like more of a textualized form in these highland regions. There are two actors that really influence in terms of shaping identity in Myanmar highland. One is missionary, American Baptist Mission, who arrived in Burma in 1813, and another actor is the British colonizations, who conquered the land in 1885. So what happened was, before the colonization, Myanmar, these highland region were, we'll say, that politically kind of like quite autonomous. There is less influence on the valley societies. There's no religion there, basically animism. So Buddhism was not climbed, like written script was not climbed in these kind of like mountain area. What we seen was the arrival of missionary make kind of like transform the identity in this highland through baptizing, through kind of like inventing written scripts and schoolings, and the introduction of printing press, which kind of like produce a standardized group consciousness. So it's kind of like basically how unifying kind of like scattered communities who share kind of like language, history, or myth into kind of like more of kind of a unified kind of like group into one groups, which become much more durable. The identity has much more durable. And the second was the British colonizations. That has, I think, impact in two ways. The first was the introduction of census. So that introduction of census kind of like change from more fluidity to kind of like a permanent ethnic categories. community are kind of like more encouraged to identify as, like more kind of like broader level, like Chiang, Kachin, or Karen. And the other was the introduction of the modern cartographies, which produce kind of like border or territorial identity. So before that, what happened was in this highland region, we have seen the British kind of like doing indirect administrations. Through indirect administration is basically kind of like allowing their local chief, but kind of like try to kind of like these local chief acting on the behalf of the British. So in this highland, like Chiang, Kachin, and Karen, we have seen kind of like the enactment of Salween Hill Tract Regulation, which was in 1892, Kachin Hill Regulations, 1895, and Chin Hill Regulation, it was in 1896. So what happened was it kind of like encouraged, this diverse community under kind of like more fixed homeland. But at the same time, what happened is kind of like divide community into kind of like different kind of like, territory. So, after colonizations, what happened was there's like, independent in 1947s, that kind of like further shaped identity and mobility into kind of like different trajectory. Post-colonial law institutionalized the colonial kind of like produced identities, and identity has become so much territorial based. So what happened was this post-colonial Myanmar regimes, adopt the pre-colonial kind of like ethnic classifications. There was the first one, and then based on the previous creation of like Chiang Hill, Kachin Hill, and others, the modern Chin State, Kachin State, and other was kind of like produced. So the identity becomes much more broad and much more territorial, and political right recognition and access to state resource was kind of like tied to ethnic identity. So it's kind of like reinforcing like fixed notion of belonging. So what happened was, to some extent, the modern state is recognizing some of the pre-colonial identity, but at the same time, certain identity are kind of like not just neglected, like kind of like difficult to accept by the modern state, such as the religious identity, Christianity or Islam, right? So it was kind of like these religion arrived before the colonization, but what happened was these religion are kind of like widespread, especially under the colonization. So there is this kind of like see as a part of the foreign identities. And alongside with that, is also kind of like become not accepting the written script of minority language. For instance, before before the colonizations, when the missionary arrived, they create the written language, written script based on Roman alphabet for Chiang and Kachin, and Karen is like I think more of a Sanskrit. So like these written identity are kind of like more reluctant to accept by the the modern state. So what happened was kind of like teaching and publication of like ethnic languages are restricted. So kind of to summarize, the modern Myanmar armed conflicts or like communal conflict is so much kind of like based on the acceptance and kind of like the pushing back of these like identities. Most of these identity that kind of like developed during the colonizations, and the question of like identity fluidity and rigidity kind of like largely depend on, I think, like two two factors. One is, I think, the acceptance. One is the capacity of the state. So when I said the capacity of the state, not just the Myanmar regime, but also it's kind of like neighboring, right? So one example that I would like to give is after 2021, what we see was community in Chiang, Kachin and Karen. Like Chiang has much more kind of like closer connection to Mizo, who has their kind of like similar language or share kind of like myth or share origin, right? But they are now part of the Indian because the Indo-Burma border was not kind of like fenced, or it was not kind of like strictly kind of like guarded. And then part of it was in Mizoram, they practice the federalisms, and where local government has a certain amount of power. But at the same time, if we look at the Karen state, even though like there are like Karen community in Myanmar and Thailand, we see kind of like less kind of like support by these two community after 2021. So basically, it's kind of like the connection and mobility of the identity is in part so much depend on the capacity of the state in terms of enforcing it. And the second was the how community see this identity, right? So what happened was, the name after independence, we have seen a loss of a loss of ethnic label are changing, like even the country names, like from Burma to Myanmar, and then we have seen the name changing from Arakan to Rakhine, Karen to Kayen, and Garani to Kaya, right? And then what we see is that is so much depends on whether this community accept the identity or not. So it's like, for instance, these ethnic community are so much more kind of accepted to Arakan or Karen or Karani, right? And then all those, the ethnic kind of like modern state of the ethnic territories are, the identity, although the identity is so much based on territory, what we've seen is that the emergence of ethnic armed rebellions, these ethnic arms are kind of like pushing their border to have to be include more of other share linguistic or same religion. When this boundary was kind of like draw, there are some of the share kind of like ethnic some share kind of similar linguistic and religions are not part of it. Some are kind of like separated into other modern nation state. Some are kind of like left out into internally Myanmar kind of like different kind of like state. Like for instance, like the territory of the Chiang and Kachin, territory of Chiang and Rakhine has become so much problem because of it's like inclusions of certain ethnic groups, right? And the final point was the concept of belonging is not always kind of like in line with the citizenship. Of course, if we look at the Rohingyas, like people talk about the citizenship, but if we look at the ethnic minority, especially in these highland areas, they are, it's like Myanmar citizen. But what we have seen is that they have multiple imagined communities. So we can see that their attachment to ethnicity, religions, clan, or the homeland of Chin State or Kachin State is much more stronger than the modern nation state concepts. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, BP. All right, last but not least, I'll give the floor to Dr. Prista Ratanapruck to present.
Thank you, Ariel. Maybe I can share screen.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be sharing my work with scholars working in Southeast Asia. Even though my work is about a community of traders from northern Nepal, the talk today will show how they have become members of many Southeast Asian societies. So today I'd like to share a story about a mobile and geographically dispersed community that is multilingual, multi-ethnic, and belong to multiple nation states. I want to talk about how they have sustained and reproduced themselves as a community across a vast geographical space and over generations. The story is articulated in my recently published book, Market and Monastery, Capitalism in the Manangi Trade Diaspora. The book traces the connection between the Himalaya with South Asia and Southeast Asia through their movement. So this diaspora is a Tibetan ethnic trading community from Manang Valley in northern Nepal. So this is where the valley is located. And these traders used to trade on caravan between Tibet and India since as early as in the 17th century. And this is a valley. This is what the valley looked like. This is the valley where they're from. It's arid and dry, which was the reason why they went trading initially. And over time, they have shifted to expand their trade into Northeast India, and then overland into Northeast India, into Thailand, and Malaysia and Singapore. They have also traveled on British ship to Calcutta, to Madras, to Rangoon, and to Penang, and to Singapore. So they travel as British subjects using on the British ship. And since the 1960s, they have shifted to take advantage of air transportation and have been supplying gemstones to jewelry shops throughout Malaysia and Singapore. And as the Manangi traveled and traded, they have also settled abroad, especially when they have married local women. And some have converted to Islam. This is a picture of a Malay Manang family in Kuala Lumpur celebrating Hari Raya. Their names, as you see, reflect a hybrid cultural practice. That the Manangi were open to engage with outsiders, but not only in their own term, have resulted in a diaspora that is translocal, multi-ethnic, and multilingual. My book examines how cross-cultural interaction have shaped polities and societies across Asia. It develops a framework for studying the movement of people, artifacts, and ideas across national, religious, and ethnic boundaries, and focusing on spheres of interaction such as trade and kinship. It traces social relations across dispersed spaces, showing how external engagements shape internal dynamics within society. So up until the 18th century, all trading diaspora, such as the Manangi, have formed the backbone of trade in Asia. And this map shows the extensive Silk Road and Arab Sea routes. And merchant diaspora communities emerge from multiple homelands across Asia, underscoring long-standing patterns of mobility and trans-regional exchange. But in the established historiography of trade, the arrival of Western trading empires from the Portuguese to the Dutch and the British have triggered the decline and dispersal of these old trading networks. While this is generally true, the trade networks of some merchant diasporas have thrived for centuries. And my work seeks to understand what has enabled an old trade diaspora like that of the Manangi to thrive, despite the presence of larger counterparts. So not only have the Manangi thrived, but they have also rose to become one of the wealthiest entrepreneurial communities in Nepal. And many are wealthy entrepreneurs in Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. So from itinerant gem traders, they have, for example, become owners of hotels, airlines, winery, agrochemical company, pharmaceutical company, carpet and pipe factories in Nepal. And in Thailand, they have shifted to invest in silver jewelry production for export to Japan, the UK, and North America. And in Malaysia and Singapore, they have supplied precious gemstone, including diamond, to high-end jewelry shops. So not only have their business expanded, but they have also generated sufficient economic surplus to finance ambitious social and religious projects, supporting large collective praying ritual in Nepal. And this happens every few months when large fraction of population in the monastery, every few months, these collective praying rituals that you see, and a large fraction, they could also generate a large surplus that they could support a large fraction of population in the monastery. And they, aside from collective praying rituals, they have also been able to build raise fund to build large religious monuments. They could also raise fund for construction of public goods, such as Mountain Road to Manang Valley. And they were also able to provide relief during flood and earthquakes to citizens in Nepal. So my book seeks to understand what social arrangements and ideas have enabled the Manangi to sustain and expand their trade, extending from the Himalaya to South and Southeast Asia from the 19th century onward, and become part of Southeast Asian economies and societies. My research examines 3 key social institutions that have enabled the Manangi to sustain and reproduce a transregional, multilingual, and multi-ethnic diaspora across South and Southeast Asia. So these key social institutions include cross-cultural marriages with local women. This is a picture of Ali, who is married to a Malay woman, and his daughter, Farah. This one. After having married a Malay woman and settled in Malaysia, he has been able to help traveling Manangi set up shops in Kuala Lumpur. And he has helped Orient Manangi traders in their host society. And despite being Muslim, he has also helped raise funds for the building of Buddhist stupa in Lumpini. So cross-cultural families such as Ali are points of connections between local and translocal economies, societies, and cultures. And the second institutional arrangement that I looked at in my research is the formation of rooming houses abroad, which serves as point of convergence where the Manangi pool knowledge and trade about their trade. And this is a rooming house in Singapore. These houses, which dot the trade routes, are managed by Manangi women who come to manage the house as if it's her own lodge. She would come for 3 months at a time, which is the duration of the tourist visa. And the third institutional arrangements that I looked at in my work is the pooling of cash at home in Nepal for organizing social and religious festivals. So almost every other month, the Manangi organize large collective praying rituals which they take turns sponsoring by donating money to support the events. Here you see traders, when they have returned to their home, they make donation to support the large collective rituals. But however, when the money is pooled for organization of large religious rituals and for construction of religious monuments, it is first circulated as loan. And this loan has enabled reinvestment in trade and expansion of their economy. And aside from pooling money for collective praying rituals, the Manoa also organized an archery festival that involved betting as well as card games. Right. And lottery ticket sales. And 15% of the winning and the bets go to the village fund. And this fund supported social and religious projects such as the building of schools and roads and health clinics. And then before they're used for these purposes, the funds are circulated as community loans. So participation in gambling was required based on financial capacity. For example, property-owning households had to buy more lottery tickets than renters. So gambling functioned as a kind of wealth tax. It pulls surplus from trade for redistribution as loan. And all the accounting are settled and clarified at the end of each festival. So aside from the archery festival, the Manoa also hosts many clan reunions where they also pool money according to their financial capacity to circulate as loan. So the pooling of funds collectively at these religious and social gatherings allowed the circulation of capital widely in the community, which facilitated the expansion of their trans-regional trade and further investment in the formal economy in different nation states. The large social gatherings also enabled dispersed community members to get to know one another and to get to know their moral character as well. So the social and religious gatherings are therefore institutional nodes that collapse spatial and cultural distance, allowing the Manoa to verify trust and credibility and to renew social relations. So this diagram shows the different forms of social and religious and kinship networks that pool and redistribute capital, social and material resources at multiple social scales. We may view the Manoa society as a sophisticated welfare state where capital is accumulated, redistributed, and reproduced at the intersection of kinship and religion across a large trans-regional space. So my book illuminates how an airline in Nepal, gem trading in Singapore, silver production in Bangkok, a rooming house in Malaysia, cross-cultural families in Southeast Asia, all of fundraising at home in Nepal and fundraising in the diaspora, monastery building and monastery chanting, all of these are part of the same trans-regional economy that connects the Himalaya with Southeast Asian economies and society, while also sustaining a trans-regional society that is multilingual and multi-ethnic and a part of multiple nation states. So, and I would like to share that my book is also available for free as an open access edition. If you Google Market and Monastery, it will bring up the book website where you can download a free PDF copy. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prista. These are great presentations. We have our three presenters who presented on very different presentations on that looks at different temporal and scale of immigration and mobility and belonging and national identity in the region, Southeast Asia, but also connect to South Asia as well. I guess I only have one question for our panelists. before we move to a Q&A. So, in thinking about your own work, right, whether through academia or through advocacy work, how do you think your work lent us frameworks, right, methodologically or conceptually, to rethink about nationalism, belonging, and trans-regional research on mobility in Southeast Asia? So anyone can feel free to take the question. You can take turn. Do you want me to repeat the question? Sorry. Okay. So in terms of how your work, like, and their contribution to conversations about mobility and belonging, right? How do you think your work contribute to building new frameworks, right? Like conceptually, methodologically, and help others, like scholars or civil societies, governments, to think about issues of nationalism, belonging, immigration, or the last presentation, right, on trans-regional mobility for trade and marriage, right? What contributions can your work provide through advocacy or through research?
Perhaps I can share about conceptually. I think all these works have shown that we can think of society not as bounded, and that we can pay attention to external engagement, and that how these external engagements are really shaping dynamics within the society. And both in my own case, how it has reshaped dynamics within the Manangi community, and also how these cross-cultural marriages has shaped the whole society as well. And I think with the case of the Rohingya refugee, we also see that the presence of the Rohingya has shaped dynamics within the whole society as well. And I think another point I think that I see is the point that Lian mentioned, that belonging is not only tied to territorial identity, and that we can think of belonging as belonging to a network, to non-territorial base. As in the case of Manangi traders, they are not a part of a particular nation state, but they're part of the larger trans-regional network where people are of multiple nationality, multiple culture, multiple ethnicity. So membership in a broad trans-regional network that is broader than just territorial nation state. This is what I see across my work and the work that has been presented.
Yeah, let me kind of give a short comment on that. So for this, my research kind of rely on the concept of William, Van Scandals, the one who kind of coined Zomia. And one thing that I really like was sometimes regional study kind of like give unique kind of like knowledge, but at the same times it make us blind because we are so much focused on the modern territory. And so when we look at these like Myanmar Highland region, I myself, it's like I was mostly kept looking at these ethnic group in Myanmar, but these are the groups who are divided into 2 or 3 modern nation states. And sometimes, studying this group only through the kind of like the land of modern nation state only give us like only one perspective. And one of the best example would be, after military coup in Myanmar, we have seen, the Chin people in Myanmar western part got a lot of support from, the Mizo, um, which is kind of like the consequence of, over the decade, there is like people-to-people relations. The Chin diaspora community in US, Australia, they invite, celebrity famous singer from Mizo. And when, Myanmar military bombed in the Indo-Burma area, there is the Indian border task force denied that the bomb was landed to their territory, but it was the Mizo kind of like civil society who publicly condemned that it was landed in that area, and then that affected their communities too. So we need to kind of like more pay attention to what Professor Prista mentions, like not only the territorial based identities, kind of, we also need to look at it's like multiple kind of like dimension point of views.
All right. On the notions of the non-territory that Dr. Prista also built on, I'll probably share a story of 3 years ago when I received a text from an Afghani refugee who were unable to, who cannot speak English and got resettled in Australia. And he told me a story. Hey, Gading, I was just coming back in Bahasa, he said, because he can speak Bahasa. I just came back from the market and I actually met with the Sri Lankan refugees we both actually live in West Java in Cisarua, where Ima used to be based at that time. And we both cannot speak English. I definitely don't speak Tamil, and the Sri Lankan doesn't speak Farsi. And we both speak Bahasa in a market in Australia because that's the language they know, which to me is quite interesting because look, there are so many potentials, especially cultural aspects, and also the potential contributions that this community haven't been explored by the stakeholders, where they, rather than seeing them as the people who are not coming from territory, we should have probably seen what the contributions that we can build among this cross-cultural community. I cannot share much on that further because the thing with the temporariness that I mentioned earlier, the transit perspective, I think Anjamis wrote quite a lot of research on it, on the travel transit, is the one that creates this, or is probably stopping that there is this part of Indonesia and not part of Indonesia. And this is something that becoming, I don't know, probably stopping people to move forward. And worse, on my daily life, it's stopping people from probably even discussing about the right pace approach. So before negotiating about work or even marriage, because I started as a legal aid and dealing with intermarriage refugees and the local, it's not even recognized. So how can you actually build upon that further? Well, your discussion before even talking about contribution, you start talking about survival. So this is the thing that it's quite a bottlenecking in my world. But in terms of the last thing that I want to say, because I have to answer your questions, I think at some certain extent, culture of hospitality needs to be acknowledged and remember. I would like to quote the late Pope Francis: to welcome, to protect, to promote, and to integrate. And what I'm trying to say here by interpreting what Pope Francis mentioned is not necessarily by the system, but among the people it can happen. It's the people to people. And that's how the story of Australia between the Sri Lankan and Afghani can happen. Over.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gading, for Dr. Gading, for sharing that. I want to highlight, I think there's a contrast between the case of Rohingya refugee and the case of the Manangi traders, because the Manangis travel on tourist visa when they come and go, and because their trade is informal. And then when they married local women, they become member of a community, of a local community. And by becoming a member of local community, they become member of the local nation state, right? So in a sense, their marriage is being recognized. But in the case of Rohingya refugee, it's striking that when marriage with local residents, with local community is not being recognized legally, right? So that is really the difference.
Legally and
And
sometimes even culturally, like people
mm,
get a stigma for there's a one forum I said it's like, look, we have to be careful with the refugee because they're very very masculinistic, a very bad perspective. Look at these refugees, they're marrying our woman. I mean, that's in a formal forum. So how can you move forward with that? Well, we still have that sort of a stigma. So not only legal, Dr. Prista, but also cultural. It can create stigma when you actually marry with a local.
Okay.
Sorry, Ariel, it was
Oh,
we can
no,
hear the
these
discussion.
are very lively conversations. I actually want to move to the Q&A. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A that maybe we can take this conversation further, right? So I want to just condense Ka Charles' question, Ka Charles Han question for two of our speakers, right? So first one for Gading, you highlighted belonging and prolonged displacement issues, which leads to policy implementation gap where rules and regulations are not well implemented. This is a challenge faced by locals and indigenous peoples across Indonesia. What would be your recommended solution? And his other question to Dr. Prista, thank you for highlighting Banagi challenges. Migration is somewhat a survival mechanism when a community or tribe lose out in a territorial dispute. There are many indigenous people across Southeast Asia, right? Ohangana, Manyawa people in Halmahera. How should inclusive planning be advocated to the political leaders in the midst of stronger capital power push? All right, I'll give the floor to our both speakers who the questions is directed to.
I can probably start if it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of the indigenous, GRS do not work specifically for the indigenous groups in Indonesia unless there is a displacement. So I think it's best to say the disclaimer first. But I'm fully aware, as Indonesian myself, about the issues of the indigenous people itself, and especially because my line of work on the advocacy, we touch a lot on the human rights issues in Indonesia, and that's how I probably addressed it from the right-based perspective. And definitely it started with the solidarity among different communities, so indigenous and others. For instance, I'll give you probably a concrete example. In the past 6 until 12 months, I've been working on the advocating for the new presidential regulations. It's the national framework in Indonesia on the refugee status, or the refugees handling and also protection. It didn't have the word protection, and we tried to include the word protection there. What we learned from is that there are a lot of communities or marginalized communities, including the indigenous, where they actually have the advocacy works by conducting engagements with other groups. So in our case, it was with the disability community who actually passed the law in Indonesia on the disability law, for example, the protection for the disability community. So by using the right-based approach, then we start seeing that rather than putting a category, oh no, this is a refugee woman, we see that this is a woman as a whole across Indonesia. So this is a child refugees rather than a refugee child. Because once you actually start seeing refugee child, then you only focus on the refugees and you do not integrate it with the other child. The same with the indigenous. Although I'm fully aware that the issue can be very specific. In terms of indigenous, we are talking about the land, we're talking about the repressions and others. But in terms of solidarity, I think once we get our work together, especially if we can come across on the champions among the stakeholders, both of the government and also the non-government sectors, I think there is a way. It's a long way, but I mean, it has to start, no? Over.
Dr. Prista?
Yeah, sorry. Would you mind reading the question one more time, please?
Oh, yeah, sure. So Charles asked, thank you for highlighting the Manangi challenges. Migration is somewhat a survival mechanism when a community or tribe lose out in a territorial dispute. So there are many indigenous people across Southeast Asia, right? He gave an example, Kohongana Manyawa people in Halmahera. So the question is, how should inclusive planning be advocated to the political leaders in the midst of stronger capital power push?
I think there has to be a recognition that people have been moving for a long time throughout history, and that mobility is a long-standing phenomenon, and that when we try to patrol the border, it can then the practice doesn't align with the reality, and perhaps nation states can see that new members can also contribute to their society as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Next question comes from Xiaopeng Wan from University of Music, Performing Arts, Vienna, and University of Malaysia. They say, I would be interested while we're discussing what I would call diaspora information, quote unquote diaspora information, or forced migration. What is the role for us as researcher? There's many discussion regarding the role of public power. There's without doubt that public power do affect, but how about the community themselves? Should I type the question? Should I put the question in the chat? I couldn't, for some reason I couldn't, let's see. Can the questioner, do you want to ask the question directly? Sorry. I don't know if they're still here, but yes, the question is on the rule for us as researcher in thinking about quote unquote diaspora information or forced migration. There's many discussion regarding the role of public power. There's without a doubt that public power do affect, but how about the community themselves? Okay. Anyone want to take any takers for this question?
Yeah, I can cover a little bit, although I'm not covering, although, migration is not necessarily my topic. But one thing we have seen in Myanmar was, especially after 2021 was the significant role of diaspora communities, especially in terms of, raising, money and donation for their communities, because we have seen civil disobedience movement was largely carry, which include not going to the office. So a loss of state, when I say state, the military control kind of operation are becoming very limited. The service could not really go to the other area. So diaspora community are contributing a lot with monies and other resources and advocacy. So one important thing for the researcher is when we engage this diaspora community, I think it is really important to not revealing their private informations. As a researcher, when engaging with, they are so much influential. but ethical guideline or something that we should be really mindful of, especially in the context of a country where there is a loss of so much going on in terms of politically and armed conflicts. This is something that I learned from my experience. It's like going there, interview, that's good, but at the same time we should be really mindful of it's like not revealing their informations.
Okay, if not, I guess we have one more final question from the audience, and then we'll conclude from here. From the same person, what should we pay attention to while applying classic identity theories, right? From your experience, whether there's difficulties applying these theories for examining Southeast Asia context. I'll start with Dr. Prista. You want to take this one?
Yes, I think what I see is that I think the classic idea identity is fluid, right? And we also see that identities are not mutually exclusive, right? People can belong to multiple communities. A member of a religious community, member of a particular ethnic group, member of a nation state, member of identity that is tied to a place. And these memberships are not mutually exclusive. They're not always, and they're overlapping. And I think when we see the fluid, this is a classic idea in conception of identity. And then what we see here is that how these identities are negotiated in different contexts.
I think,
oh,
yeah, one quick comment, Ariel.
right.
A lot of classical kind of nationalism so much focus on homogenizations of religion, language, or territorial. And one really important thing is we need to kind of more emphasize, or the policy maker need to more emphasize on like civic nationalism, which is kind of like more on the ideologies, political inclusion, rather than so much focus on race, religions, and
Yeah.
territory.
Okay, thank you. We want to continue this conversation. Unfortunately, the time has come to an end. We are very grateful from the Center for Southeast Asian Studies to our speakers for today, Gading Putra, Lian, Thang, and Dr. Prista Ratanapruck for your time and wisdom and insights. And I'll pass it over to Teri to close us off.
Well, thank you very much, Ariel, for moderating this amazing discussion, and Gading, BP, and Prista for your presentations. It's so eye-opening to be able to look at the fluidity and movement of peoples underneath this imposed structure of nation states and boundaries. So hopefully there'll be more discussion, and your research and work will open up more understanding and more empathy for people stuck in gray areas in between. So thank you so much for your time and spending it with us today. We really appreciate it. I'd like to thank all of our viewers for joining us. And I believe there's a survey in the chat, and I think also possibly the link to our YouTube channel. So when we have this video ready, you'll be able to find it there, as well as I encourage you to look at a lot of our other previous talks also. This is the last loose webinar for this academic year, and our next webinar will be in September. Again, we'll always focus on the first Wednesday of each month for our webinars. So in Southeast Asia, that will be on Thursday morning, and Wednesday in Hawaii, as well as Wednesday night for people on the continental US. So please go to our website and sign up for our newsletter so you can stay informed about when our events occur. So thank you again very much for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciate your time and expertise. Aloha.
Thank you very much.